Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Meyer Tech. Today I wanted to talk about budget PC builds. I wanted to talk about this particularly because there's a lot of misconceptions about budget PCs. The biggest one being that a budget CPU is AMD. That's not true right now. Don't build a budget PC with AMD this moment. In fact, even when Ryzen comes out, they're not going to be the best budget CPU. The best budget CPU is Intel Pentium. Currently, a $65 Pentium G4560 will beat any AMD CPU in single and 4-core performance. 4-core is important because a lot of apps will actually only use 4 cores. Nowadays, we're getting to see more closer to 8, and hopefully with Ryzen we'll push that boundary and we'll start to see more and more. After that, my advice now won't be relevant anymore, but it probably will be for a little bit longer yet. Right now, the 4-thread but dual-core Pentium G4560 is the best budget CPU. You might be asking yourself, well, I can spend a little bit more than $65 on a CPU. Why don't I go with an i3? Bad idea. Fun fact. Currently, the second best i3, the i3 7300, is $150 and it is 15% faster than the Pentium G4560. So it is 2.3 times more expensive, but 15% faster. That is not worth it. The rest of the i3 lineup is similarly poor. I mean, the i3 7100 is maybe 10% faster for double the price. That's just not worth it. If you are getting a budget PC, no i3 for any situation is currently worth buying. You either go Pentium for the Pentium 4560, or if you don't plan on having a dedicated GPU in your system, I would suggest going with a Pentium 4600 because it has a much better integrated GPU, while basically the same clock speeds for an extra $25 US. If you don't really plan on doing any gaming but might do some lighter gaming, then the 4600 might actually be perfect. The integrated GPU in it is good enough to play most modern titles at basically low settings at 1080p. Another common question is probably, you should wait for Ryzen. Not true. In this case. For most cases, I would consider waiting for Ryzen, at least to see how it turns out. If you're thinking about getting something like an i5 or an i7, then absolutely you should wait for Ryzen. But if you're considering entry-level basic gaming and computing, then the $65 level that you can get a Pentium with adequate performance, Ryzen isn't actually coming out with something at that level. The cheapest Ryzen CPU is $130, and it's the 4-core, 4-thread. So it competes with the i5 in performance and the i3s in price. Whereas the Pentium is going to give you not as good performance, but still pretty okay performance, and be a lot cheaper. Even after Ryzen comes out, I think the Pentium G4560 is going to be worth buying for a super budget PC. Beyond that, what should you get for a GPU? Well, if you're building a budget PC, your options are you could go on eBay, buy something used. You might be able to find a good deal. It's probably worth having a look at. You might not go that route, but it's worth having a look at. You might find some deals. Other than that, if you're buying new, for a very low-end budget PC, I would consider either the AMD RX 460 or an NVIDIA GTX 1050. Now, the 1050 is about $150, and it performs better than the 460 by a bit. It's definitely ahead, whereas the 460 is about $30 to $40 cheaper, With either of those graphics cards, you're going to be gaming at 1080p at the most demanding AAA titles with that CPU on mid to low settings, probably more low settings if it's a really more demanding game, but with those two things you will be able to play any title on the market. Absolutely any one. Won't be ideal necessarily, but you'll be able to play them. To give you an idea of the specs, this PC so far with a Pentium and either an RX 460 or a GTX 1050 is going to be more powerful than the PlayStation 4 or Xbox One, but not as powerful as the PlayStation 4 Pro. So that's what you can expect. Moving on from there, we've got motherboards. Motherboards is a more difficult selection because it's less obvious which is necessarily better. Having a motherboard does not give you performance directly. That used to be the case a long time ago, but it isn't. Motherboards, all they do is connect things together. So you want to buy a motherboard with the connectivity options that you want. Now, with a Pentium G4560, you are going to want either an H110 motherboard. I would more recommend going for something like a B250 motherboard. These offer a fair bit more features and connectivity options, things like M.2, USB 3.1 Gen 2, and B250 motherboards honestly aren't that much more expensive than the H110s. It's a fair jump. I would not recommend for a budget build getting either the H270 or the Z270 boards. The features on those motherboards are likely to go to waste, and it's going to be a lot more expensive on the budget build. For RAM, choice of RAM should be pretty simple. One of the things about the B250 boards is it comes with 4 DIMM slots. A DIMM is just the term for a stick of RAM, basically. So for RAM, you're going to want DDR4. That's important. That's the only kind of RAM that's going to work in one of these motherboards. DDR3 is ages past now. But you don't need to pick the best RAM. You might see options, you might see things like 2400 megahertz RAM or 3000 megahertz RAM. Honestly, the difference in performance in gaming between the 2400 megahertz RAM and the 3000 or up is going to be negligible to non-existent. Games simply do not use the memory bandwidth to require very fast RAM. There are some applications that do, but not for the budget gamer. You shouldn't be considering fast RAM. Other than that, the two main things to consider when buying your RAM is 1, you want to buy a RAM from a company that you've heard of, and 2, you want it to look cool. I'm actually not kidding. That's basically how much it matters. There are so many regulations in place for RAM that unless you're buying some really cheap knockoff, which if you're buying from a notable retailer, you're not gonna get that sort of thing. If you go to some place like NCIX or Newegg, you basically can't go wrong. All manufacturer RAM is gonna be basically the same, and it doesn't matter, so buy what looks cool. It's as simple as that. For the amount of RAM that you're gonna want, you're probably gonna want to look at least 8 gigabytes. For a budget build, I would say 8 gigabytes is about right, probably 2 sticks of 4. And honestly, I would stick at that. Even if you have the budget, there's probably other places that I would go for that kind of budget build than more RAM. Although, if you get it for cheap, going up to 16 gigabytes of RAM probably isn't going to hurt you. Next big question is storage. You may have heard of something called SSDs. There's also something called HDDs. Now, most people in more expensive builds will have a large capacity hard drive disk and a low capacity solid state. They'll have their operating system, the main games that they play that they want to be really fast on the solid state storage, and then the rest of their games as well as all of their music, movies, media can go on the slow storage because it doesn't need to be fast. If you have the budget for it, get a very small 250 gigabyte solid state drive and a 1 terabyte hard drive. If you can't afford both of those, get the solid state drive. You can always add a hard drive later. It's very easy and they're very inexpensive. I would suggest doing it this way because it is easier to add a hard drive later than to move your installation onto an SSD sooner. And a solid state drive is probably the first thing that I would recommend to speeding up your system and getting really good perceived performance. It's not going to improve your frame rates. It's not going to make processing or gameplay happen faster, but things like your boot up time, the game load times, program launch times, media open times, those are all going to be decreased on a solid state drive. And honestly, at this point, solid state storage has come down to the point that it's accessible. You can get a good 250 gigabyte solid state drive for about $120. That's very reasonable. I would consider doing that before getting a hard drive if you can only afford one. Now, one of the last pieces we'll talk about is the power supply. The power supply is like the heart of the computer. It provides power, as you might expect, to all of the components within the system. A good power supply is worth investing in if you can afford it. You'll see things like 80 bronze, 80 platinum, 80 gold. Basically, those are talking about efficiencies. The better quality power supply you have, the less wasted power you're going to have. Thus, the lower your power bill is going to be for the set of components in your computer. It is a large misconception to PC builders that you need a large power supply. This is not true. For this kind of budget build, even 400 watts is more than enough. 400 watts is lots with plenty of overhead. The main downside to lower wattage PSUs or power supplies is that the very low wattage ones, something like under 400 watts, they're going to be very low quality. Whereas if you get at least a 600 watt, you're going to have very good quality. For a budget build, this is one of the first things I would actually suggest investing a little bit more than you might expect into, because it might actually be worth it. You're going to get better power efficiency and better reliability. A bad power supply that breaks can actually destroy some of the other components in your system. So for peace of mind, a power supply is worth investing in. The last thing we have to talk about is the case. Buy a case that you think looks nice and fits your budget. Sometimes you can find a case bundled with a power supply. Those are acceptable for very low budget builds, but not generally recommended because those are very poor quality power supplies. The other thing to watch out for here is compatibility with the motherboard. If you have an ATX motherboard and a micro ATX or MATX case, your case will not fit. For a budget PC, both for the motherboard and for the case, I recommend looking for MATX. They're going to be small and compact and inexpensive. The discerning viewer might notice that I left a few things out. First of all, I did not talk about a CPU cooler or case fans. Those are topics for more advanced builds and not for budget builds. The Pentium G4560 actually comes with a passable heatsink with thermal paste already on it. It's not going to be great quality, but you can't overclock these CPUs anyway, so it's going to be acceptable. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you think I deserve it, give me a like and a subscription, and I'll see you at the next video.